Hello, Debate High. Today, as promised, we will be taking an in-depth look at a sample affirmative case. This case in particular is the one I ran for the 2020 January-February season, under the resolution, States ought to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. I thought we should start off by analyzing a fairly complex affirmative, just so we can get our feet wet into the world of multi-layered cases. This AFF case is composed of a framework based on human dignity and a standard of reducing structural violence. It has two contentions. Each of them can be used as standalone and function independently. However, the combination of both make for a stronger case. I like to open up all my cases with a brief introduction, and most of the time, a quote. This case is no different. As you see here, highlighted in blue, we have an Oppenheimer quote. Since the affirmative has the unique advantage of initial ethos building, I like to open up all my affirmatives with a strong quote. Right here, we have a quote by Julius Robert Oppenheimer, a professor of physics at the University of California, Berkeley. So, before we go on, let's dissect the quote. Initially, we start off with the first sentence, in which we introduce who is speaking, what their credentials are, and what their relevance is in terms of the resolution. But before we move on, let's just give you some background on who Oppenheimer actually was. So Oppenheimer was a physicist at UC Berkeley who was largely credited for putting UC Berkeley's physics department on the map. He was one of the leading scientists in charge of working on the Manhattan Project. In terms of relevancy, he was one of the leading scientists behind the whole operation. Julius Robert Oppenheimer really knows his stuff, and his name carries a lot of weight. When the judge in the back of the room hears you quoting him, it just adds to your ethos, it adds to your character, and it shows and proves to not only the judge, but to also your opponent that you know what you're talking about. All this is very useful in the metagame. When you have a good quote, you show that you have an elevated understanding over the subject matter. That adds to your character ethos, which is always a plus. The second sentence addresses the duality of the reaction. When Julius Robert Oppenheimer says, "Some people laughed," he acknowledges that some people rejoice at the scientific advancement, unaware of the destructive tool their work would have unleashed on humankind. When he says a few people cried, he acknowledges that there are people who realize the destructive power they have just unleashed upon the world. Their tears are an acknowledgement that they have just unleashed Pandora's box. However, the most impactful part of the quote is when he says, "Most people were silent." This shows that the average person, John Q. Public, was unaware of what just happened. They would only realize the magnitude of what horrors nuclear weapons could produce after the fact they have been committed. The second part of the quote shows us that now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that, one way or another. This is hook, line, and sinker. This is what will catch the attention of everyone in the room. Here, Oppenheimer reveals the true nature of his creation. Nuclear weapons are death. They have become death. In his lab, he has created the destroyer of worlds. This part creates an eerie and spooky tone surrounding nuclear weapons. This benefits the AFF, whose goal is to create a negative association with nuclear weapons. If you have succeeded in creating some sort of emotion in your judge or audience for that matter, then you have created great ethos around your character, which can only help you win the case. And you will win many rounds. Not only that, but you will look and feel like a better debater. Before we continue to analyze this case, I think it would be wise to explain the principal arguments. This case uses two principal arguments, the nuclear structural violence and the nuclear industrial complex, or the NIC. It's a variation of the MIC, otherwise known as the military industrial complex. The nuclear structural violence is essentially the effects of structural violence generated when society chooses to use human beings as a means to an end. In this case, to achieve nuclear proliferation, influence policy decisions, and maintain nuclear deterrence. The argument indicates that nuclear arsenals are immoral due to the existence of both passive and active threats to human beings by nuclear arsenals. The passive threat, or nuclear deterrence, is a non-consensual agreement between the government and people to partake in a policy that gambles with the lives of billions of people. This non-consensual nature of the relationship results in a metaphorical hostage-taking of civilians by governments and nuclear arms vendors. The active threat, or the actual nuclear strike, dehumanizes people, since the effects of nuclear strikes pose an irreversible, cruel, and inhumane punishment to civilians. The use of them would result in severe violations of human dignity, and it would dehumanize all of the victims involved. The second principal argument is the nuclear industrial complex, also known as the NIC. This argument is a bit more complex since it involves multiple agents ranging from corrupt governments to arm makers, such as Lockheed Martin. In essence, it is the existence of a global system of arms, making companies that have an incentive to fabricate, distribute, and encourage the acquisition of nuclear arsenals. They profit off of the indiscriminate mass murder and hostage holding of innocent individuals just to make a quick buck. In the NIC, elites have unparalleled influence over government and profit off of the death of civilians. These arguments, coupled with the human dignity framework, produce a nice case where any existence of nuclear arsenals immediately violates human dignity and throws at a risk individuals into packs of wolves. This case effectively puts the negative position into one of two camps, trading off political advantages at the cost of human dignity, or in some way justifying nuclear weapons under some sort of political advantage while conceding the NIC, both of which put you in a strategic advantage with plenty of offense to work with. Now that we more or less covered the content in this case, let's take a look at how it's structured, at least logistically wise. After the initial quote, we see a brief introduction where the principal arguments get introduced. In fact, let's take a look at the opening statement. This existence of nuclear arsenals has created and fomented a global system where corporations are incentivized to produce weapons that have robbed human beings of their dignity, holding them as hostages, reducing them to a mere means to an end. This is a moral evil. The damage inflicted on our moral fiber is immense. I have a moral and societal duty to affirm today's resolution. Resolved, states ought to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. Now, let's unpack it and let's rewind. So, the sentence, the existence of nuclear arsenals has created and fomented a global system where corporations are incentivized to produce weapons that have robbed human beings of their dignity, holding them as hostages, reducing them to a mere means to an end. That sentence right there serves two purposes. The first one is to highlight the scope of the argument. This particular case deals with a worldwide scope, as opposed to a local or regional scope, which is seen in other types of cases. Worldwide scope means that the consequences of the actions apply to the whole world. The second purpose is to explain what triggers the argument. In this case, both arguments are self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, self-fulfilling prophecies are just debate jargon that means the negative effect of an action is created by the mere existence of the agent who would commit the action. After the intro, we see that we have some definitions. In order to save space in the document, I added the definitions in form of a comment at the last word. I highly recommend doing this for aesthetic and practical reasons. First of all, it makes the doc look a lot neater and a lot cleaner. A lot better to look at, in my opinion. Also, for practical reasons, it's easy to retrieve at the click of a button. Now that we introduced the framework, we see the value is human dignity, accompanied with its corresponding definition. We also see that the standard, and it's also accompanied with its definition. In my opinion, human dignity is a very versatile value since it can be upheld in many different ways. It's one of my favorite values for that very reason. With all that being said, let's now take a look at the first contention. Nuclear arsenals constitute an immoral means of hostage-taking where states threaten the indiscriminate killing of civilians. This contention is made up of two cards, Hayashi 2015 and Lee 85. Feel free to pause the video at any second and read the cards for yourself. I will just be doing a brief overview of each card. Let's analyze Hayashi 2015. It mainly talks about how nuclear weapons rob victims of their humanity. It also discusses that an appropriate debate revolving nuclear weapons should focus on the essence of the weapon and not the strategic benefit they may appear to have. This distinction reduces the grounds a negative case could run. If your opponent would have dropped it, then my recommendation would have been to blow up the argument in your rebuttals. Lee 85 is the meat of the first contention. It explicitly states that non-consensual nature of deterrence is also hostage-taking. It also underlines and makes it known that hostage-taking is morally repulsive. This gains you a lot of ground because otherwise in order for your opponent to win this, they would have to argue that nuclear deterrence does not exist, which is empirically not true. Let's move on to the second contention. So the contention is the nuclear industrial complex perpetuates structural violence. This particular contention is split up into three subpoints: subpoint A, subpoint B, and subpoint C. Subpoint A is the elites use nuclear arsenals to influence governments. It's comprised of two cards, Harting 2017 and Harting 2019. Harting 2017 basically argues how arms makers are exerting their influence in governments in order to create a favorable position for their company. It also talks about how the revolving door mechanism inside the Pentagon presents a conflict of interest between government and the arms industry. Harting 2019 goes into more details, specifically mentioning the Pentagon spending priorities and how they are influenced by the weapons lobby, how this undermines the democratic process and it undermines public interest in favor of corporations. Let's now talk about subpoint C. Subpoint C is nuclear armed states suffer from corruption and elitism, which impair their judgment and exacerbate special interest groups. It's composed of three cards, Cohen 2011, Rivera 2017, and Dominguez 2014. Cohen 2011 makes the observation that Russia, keep in mind, a nuclear-armed country, suffers from corruption that favors elitism. Rivera 2017 takes it a step further. It makes the observation that Russia is actively creating a government-run military-industrial complex that favors nuclear weapons. This is alarming because it means that a nuclear-armed power is exacerbating the moral repulsive NIC. Dominguez 2014 makes the observation that China, another nuclear-armed state, suffers from corruption and wasteful investment that mainly benefits the elites. Its social structure is stacked up against the working class. This also undermines the democratic process and creates for situations where human dignity can be exploited. Moving on to subpoint C, which reads, the elite profit off of the nuclear industrial complex at the expense of society's well-being. This contention basically argues that the NIC is counterproductive in society. It's composed of four short cards, Chloe 2018, Baines 2018, Omoyam 2018, and Evans 2011. Chloe 2018, I hope I'm pronouncing that correct, but if I mispronounce it, please forgive me, argues that nuclear weapons have no strategic purpose in the NATO alliance, the largest military alliance in the world, keep in mind, which is an indicator of their redundancy in military operations. Baines 2018 is a reiteration of war profiteering and exploitation of innocent lives by arms corporations is morally repulsive and should be voted against by affirming the resolution. Omoyam 2018 and Evans 2011 is advocating for fundamental restructuring of our current global arms system so that we can prevent further exploitation and profiteering. These two cards, Omoyam 2018 and Evans 2011, are also known as our solvency, because when the affirmative fiats them into existence, they effectively solve for the problem presented. They solve for nuclear structural violence by getting rid of the NIC, and they solve for the NIC by actually getting rid of the actual NIC. And that has been a deep dive into a sample affirmative case. I hope that you found this video useful. It may have cleared up some doubts, and you overall learned something out of it. I hope maybe you will use the NIC arguments and nuclear structural violence arguments in maybe a future resolution. If you liked today's video, please consider sharing it to maybe your debate coach, your debate partners, or your debate squad, and help spread the word about Debate High, and help us continue our mission to provide free educational debate content for everyone, for all students,